Temperature readings have been manipulated at the primary climate data centers in the United States in order to support the global warming agenda. Now that's a strong new statement that's never been said on television before. But I want to emphasize it. After 1,000 hours or more of research, a computer programmer and a certified consulting meteorologist found that temperature data has been manipulated at U.S. government climate centers. The altered temperatures seem designed to support the global warming agenda.
A leading Russian think tank claims the British Meteorological Office's Hadley Center for Climate Change has been manipulating Russian weather data to suggest rising temperature trends. The Moscow Institute of Economic Analysis alleges the center used only a quarter of the statistics provided by Russia, ditching data that did not back the theory of global warming. It comes as world leaders gather in Copenhagen to try to salvage a new climate deal. And for more on these allegations, are now joined by RT's Laura Emmett, who's in the Danish capital for us. Well, Laura, hello there. So, are we possibly dealing with another Climategate scandal?
Well, I mean, it's certainly possible. It certainly adds to the original Climategate scandal, which I know you remember was the leakage of emails from the University of East Anglia's climate research unit, which sort of showed that data was being manipulated in order to prove this theory of man-made global warming. And the Hadley Center, about which this report that you just mentioned is about, is linked to the University of East Anglia in that they both use the same database. And so this is really an extension and, if you like, a more damning indictment of the way that temperature data is collected. As you mentioned, only 25%, this report by the Russian Institute of Economic Analysis states, only 25% of data provided by Russian meteorological stations is used in that database, which means that 40% of Russia's territory is not represented at all. And in fact, the data that they seem to have cherry-picked to use is data that does confirm anthropogenic climate change, and the data that they've chosen to leave out is data that doesn't confirm man-made climate change. Also, according to this report, a lot of the data that they have taken is data that refers to urban centres, and we all know that it's much warmer in cities generally than it is in the countryside, and so there are lots of remote meteorological stations in Russia, as I'm sure you know, and we all know that, and the data from those stations just hasn't been used. And as far as the effects of it go, I mean, this whole conference that you see behind me, which is filling up nicely going into the afternoon, is based on the research that comes from this database, which is prepared by the Hadley Center and the University of East Anglia. So if we extrapolate this over the whole of the world, particularly bearing in mind that Russia covers 10% of the dry land on Earth, then if data is being cherry-picked from all these different countries, then the effect is quite serious on the science behind climate change and what you believe climate change will be like in the next 100 years or so.
I understand that some climate scientists are suggesting to government that the situation is potentially so damaging that they'd like to see the UK global temperature record reanalysed from scratch to clear the air. And that might not be such a bad idea.
This is breaking news. The two key centers involved are the National Climate Data Center at Asheville, North Carolina, and the NASA Goddard Institute of Space Studies at Columbia University in New York City. Here's what this means. When you see a news report that the government has found that a certain month or season of the year was the warmest in history, or that 5 of the warmest years on record were in the last decade, don't believe it. Those reports are based on manipulated data. This information from the U.S. parallels what we learned in late November from the huge leak at the East Anglia University Climate Center in England. There are 4 key revelations about the U.S. data centers. First, the computer programs used at those centers to calculate world temperature averages have been dramatically altered so that the final computer product no longer averages actual temperatures from actual locations. Instead, those researchers are pulling numbers from locations which may be hundreds of miles away and applying them to that area. Secondly, the number of weather observation points has been dramatically reduced from about 6,000 to only about 1,000. Third, the vast majority of the weather stations that were eliminated were those in cooler locations at higher latitudes and elevations. And fourth, the temperatures themselves are being altered by so-called homogenization, a process that seems to always result in warmer output readings. So who are the men behind these stunning discoveries? E. Michael Smith, a computer programmer from San Jose, California, and certified consulting meteorologist Joseph DeLeo from Hudson, New Hampshire. Michael, you apparently have really discovered some significant problems with the American temperature data set, the one that our U.S. government uses to proclaim that this month or this year is the first or fifth warmest in all history. Are you telling me that those proclamations are based on bad data?
Yes, largely because the cold thermometers have been removed from the temperature data series.
I don't exactly understand, but I want to begin with, why did you get interested in this issue to start with?
Well, I had been looking at the global warming issue and thought it should be looked at to find out why it was happening. The more I looked, the more I found out it wasn't happening. When I looked in the data, I found a pattern of deletion of thermometers that was surprising, to say the least.
What do you mean by that?
At the peak, there were about 6,000 thermometers in the data series, and then around 1989 to 1990, it suddenly plummeted to around 1,500.
So let's clear this up now. You're talking about around the entire globe of the world, planet Earth, there were about 6,000 points where they were measuring the temperature and reporting it, and it was going into this data set.
That's correct.
And this was around 1970. And you're saying by 1990 they'd stopped taking the temperature at most of those places? You only had 1,500 left?
Well, in most of those places, someone was still measuring the temperature. You still had people in China and the United States thinking they're taking the temperature. But when that temperature measurement went to the NCDC, National Climate Data Center, they dropped it from the data set. So the Global Historic Climate Data Set, what everyone uses for these maps, the data flows in, but it never flows out.
So now we have data sets in the 1990s based on, let's say, 1,500 temperatures, and previous years on 6,000, and were they comparing one to the other?
Yes, the baseline...
That's apples and oranges, isn't it?
I think it's worse than apples and oranges, but that's the metaphor. They were comparing a period from 1950 to 1980 where they had thermometers in cold places with a current set of temperatures where they had deleted the thermometers from the cold places.
Now, wait a minute. Not only did they delete, but they deleted in a pattern?
Yes. So, for example, in California, in the GHCN data set, there are 4 surviving thermometers, 1 at San Francisco Airport and 3 down near LA. How do you measure the snowy Sierra Nevadas when your thermometer is on the beach in San Diego?
Or the temperature in Fresno, Bakersfield, or Death Valley?
Or any of them.
No.
They simply do not exist in the data set.
And is this true all around the world?
They exist in the baseline, but they don't exist in the current temperatures. And yes, it's true around the world. One of the more startling ones I ran into is Bolivia. There's a wonderful baseline for Bolivia, a very high mountainous country, right up until 1990 when the data ends. And if you look on the November 2009 anomaly map, you'll see a very red, rosy, hot Bolivia. How do you get a hot Bolivia when you haven't measured the temperature for 20 years?
Well, how do you?
They take the temperature from places up to 1,200 kilometers away and copy it in. They fill in with what they've got, and what they've got is the beach in Peru and the Amazon jungle.
Now, you're telling me that they've cut off temperatures, let's say the Northwest Territory, northern Canada. Have those dropped out of the data set?
There is no longer any surviving thermometer in the Northwest Territories or Yukon. Those are filled in from somewhere else, which, because there's none in the Arctic either, has to be somewhere more southerly or closer to the ocean where it's warmer.